So I am a 17-year-old male who has been living with my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, for close to a week now. It's been 5 days since I left home, and the reason for that is my parents and, to a certain extent, my older brother as well. My brother, a 27-year-old male, and I are not close, never have been, and after what happened, I don't think we can ever be. My parents and I are on even worse terms than me and my brother because of how toxic they are. For context, I grew up in a house where I was always the least important member. I used to feel like maybe my parents didn't really want me when I was a child and were doing things for me more out of obligation than out of love. They would play with me and stuff sometimes, but mostly I'd be left with nannies, and when I was old enough to be left home alone, they seemed relieved because now they wouldn't have to spend a fortune on nannies. They could go out and leave me home alone, which they did very often. Even as a kid, I'd noticed these things, but I didn't know what to make of it. Then, in high school, my parents and I stopped having whatever relationship we had at all, and there was a silent barrier between us that stopped me from ever speaking to them unless I needed something. It's not as if I hadn't tried to build a relationship with them in the past, but it was useless because they were always so distant from me. They never treated me badly or anything, but would usually just ignore my existence altogether, and that would only change for a few hours when guests would come over. For those couple of hours, my parents loved me and acted like any other normal parents would. But once those people left, it was back to silence once more. Sometimes when my brother would visit home, it was even worse, because they'd act like normal parents to him, but they'd continue to act like I wasn't even there. So I knew that they were capable of being good, caring parents, but I just wasn't worth it. It was really sad, but I had nowhere else to go, so I decided to just shut up and suck it up, because in a few months I'd be moving out for college anyway, and that would be the end of me feeling like nobody in my own home. But that changed when last week my parents suddenly started acting very nicely with me, which I didn't like at all, because I knew something wrong was going to happen, and then that's what happened. Towards the evening, my parents entered my room, and both of them were looking really squirrely but still smiling like weirdos. I couldn't handle it anymore, so I told them to just spit it out, whatever they had to say to me. They told me that they wanted me to move to the basement in 2 days, as my brother and his family were coming over to live with us, so they needed my room for their kids. My brother is married with 2 kids, aged 3 and 5. He moved out before he started college and had been living in an apartment with his wife, his high school sweetheart. Whenever he would visit home, he'd live in the guest room with his family, but it would be kind of inconvenient since it was too small and cramped for the 4 of them to be comfortable. I never offered to give up my room or anything because I didn't want to sleep on the couch or anywhere else. I needed my privacy, and I didn't like my brother much either. He was a bit of a jerk to me. He didn't believe in the idea of ignoring me like my parents did, but instead, he would come to my room and ask me a bunch of questions about my life and then make fun of me. He'd take indirect digs at me throughout, which was weird because he was 10 whole years older than me, and I'd figured that because of the age gap, he wouldn't pick on me. But even when I was in middle school and he was already graduating, he'd make sure to put me down, and as a kid, that really made me mad. It's petty, but I've never liked the guy, and I liked him even less because of how differently our parents treated us. So when my parents said that I had to give up my room for my brother and his family, I just said no and then went back to reading. They still kept standing there and told me that it was just for a couple of months, which got my attention, because usually when my brother would visit with his family, it would be for just a few days and never more than a week. I couldn't help myself and ended up asking why he'd lived here for months when he had his own apartment, and my parents told me, really uncomfortably, that the company he'd been working in had been laying off people left and right, and he'd been one of them. He'd lost his job a couple of weeks back, and since his wife had quit working after their second kid, they were struggling with money already. There were a bunch of bills to pay and kids to look out for, and apparently he hadn't been able to save much for a time of crisis like this because he was a big spender and he already didn't earn a lot. That's why he'd asked our parents if he could come live with us for a few months until he was back on his feet, and had saved enough to move into a bigger apartment than the one they'd been living in so far. They'd be saving a lot on rent money and were willing to split the other costs of living with my parents too, as long as the kids got their own room. This meant that either my parents or me, one of us would have to sacrifice our room and let the kids take over, and they'd prefer it to be me rather than them. So I was supposed to move into the basement within the next 2 days so my brother and his family could take over the house. I didn't like the basement, and I don't think anyone would willingly move there. It was dark and weird, so I told my parents that I wasn't willing to move, and if they wanted to let my brother stay with them, then they could have him and his kids live in the guest room like they usually do. My parents then dropped their whole happy act and told me that I had to move because my brother needed my room for his kids, and it didn't matter if I wanted to get out or not. I had to, because they were the owners of this house, and as long as I was living under their roof, they expected me to obey them. The classic parental technique is to get kids to do whatever they want, no matter how unfair or unreasonable it is. But I stood my ground and told them that I wasn't moving and they couldn't force me to do something I didn't want to. My mother then turned to my dad, looking all exasperated, and then made a point of telling him as loudly as she could that she knew she should have stuck to the plan of moving all my stuff to the basement tomorrow when I wasn't at home instead of giving me a heads up. I was going to visit my grandparents the next day, so apparently they'd planned on moving everything of mine downstairs anyway, and by the time I came back home I'd have no option but to accept living in the basement because they weren't going to give me a choice. I was very upset when they said that, and I ended up getting into a screaming fight with them after that statement, where I practically yelled at them for everything that had been bothering me for ages while they just stood there looking bored, which was even more aggravating. Then, once I was done shouting at them, I decided that I was going to leave this house and go tell my grandparents everything. So I started stuffing a duffel bag with everything I needed, and my parents left the room, looking pleased with themselves, because I guess they thought that they'd finally driven me to run away from home and couldn't be happier about it. As soon as I was done packing, I left the house and took the bus to my grandparents' house. There they were a little surprised to see me because they hadn't been expecting me until the next day, and they were also taken aback to see the 3 bags I was carrying. I was still angry, so I stormed into their living room and started ranting about everything immediately. Once I started, I couldn't stop because it was all just coming out in one go. For so long I hadn't breathed a word of any of this to a soul because I didn't know if they'd even believe me or not. My parents were always nice to me when we had guests over or whenever we had company, so I highly doubted that even if I talked about the way they'd been treating me ever since I was a kid, I didn't think people would buy it. But once I started telling my grandparents everything, I just didn't stop until they knew everything that had happened. They heard me out patiently, and once I stopped talking, only then did I realize that I'd been crying, and my face was all red and wet. So my grandmother wiped my face with a wet towel, and my grandpa left the room. I didn't know what to expect because neither of them said anything to me, and my grandmother just sat there with a poker face. I was too afraid to ask anything and just sat there quietly with nothing to say for 20 minutes. Then after that, my grandpa finally returned to the living room and hugged me, as he told me that I didn't have to worry about anything now because I could live with them. I wasn't conscious of crying while I'd been telling them how my parents had been neglecting me throughout my life, but when my grandpa said that, the waterworks started and didn't stop until I fell asleep. When I woke up, it was almost dinner time, but before that, my grandparents made me block all my family, including my sister-in-law. I didn't know why, and I didn't ask either because I was just glad to be rid of them. My parents hadn't called or texted me even once after I left the house, not even to ask if I was okay. So I didn't feel too bad blocking them, and it was actually a great moment of victory for me. The next 2 days, nothing really happened, apart from my grandpa coming back home with my belongings from my house. It had all been stuffed into a trash bag haphazardly, and I overheard my grandpa complaining to Grandma that apparently my parents hadn't even bothered to let him gather it all himself. They'd stuffed it all in and kept it in the front yard, which is where he'd found my things. I was disappointed that they were acting this way, because not only were they being harsh to me, but they were also disrespectful towards my grandpa. I thought that was really unnecessary, because they hadn't even done anything wrong unless my parents thought that they'd screwed up by taking me in. It didn't make sense because clearly they wanted me out of their hair, and now that they finally had what they'd wanted all these years, they were still mad. I didn't find out the real reason until yesterday when I was using my phone and received a text from an unknown number. At first they texted me nothing but "everyone hates you," so I figured it must be some kid from school trying to prank me. But then the second text said that, You've disappointed all of us. I hope you're happy with all the money you've stolen from us." That was weird, and I was about to text back telling them that they had the wrong number, but then they sent another text saying our parents lost their inheritance because you decided to open your big trap. I hope you're happy now. Everyone hates you, and we wish you'd never even been born. When I read that text, I put two and two together and realized what must have happened. I decided not to reply because it wasn't even worth it to talk to my brother, but he sent yet another text. "Our parents don't ever want to see you again. What did they even do to you? Everything you wanted you got. Nothing was ever denied, and yet you're acting like the victim. You disgust us. Selfish prick." After that text, I blocked my brother because I didn't need that sort of negativity, especially at a time like this. But it was too late, because his words were already getting under my skin, especially what he said about me always getting what I wanted. In a way, that was not entirely untrue. I was neglected, sure, but I always got what I wanted. My parents did make sure that nothing was ever denied to me when it came to finances. My parents were both doctors, so they could afford to shell out money for whatever I wanted, no matter how expensive it was. They'd even let my brother move back in because they could afford to cover the cost of him and his family living with us. Money was never something they were concerned about. My brother also occasionally borrowed money from my parents, but never too often. He liked to be independent, and my parents always made it a point to brag about that to their friends. The point is that my brother and I were never deprived of anything. I went to a fancy private school, always had the best clothes and shoes that I wanted, and never had to beg my parents for money to do anything because asking once would be enough. They never showed me any affection. That was probably my only problem with them, and when my brother put it like that in his text, I felt petty and childish. I felt like I'd cost them their inheritance by blabbing to my grandparents for no real reason apart from some stupid sibling rivalry thing. I didn't tell my grandparents about it and still haven't been able to because I feel like an idiot, a selfish idiot who went crying to his grandparents because his parents weren't being as nice to him as he'd wanted them to be. I know my feelings aren't totally invalid, but I also feel like I did something really bad and, I don't know, I feel like I betrayed my parents. I don't feel good about any of this anymore and think that I should just apologize and get it all over with. But at the same time, I also can't help thinking that my parents don't really deserve that apology. I just don't know. Am I the a-hole for telling my grandparents that my parents were treating me badly because they'd been neglecting me and then had asked me to move to the basement to accommodate my brother and his family? Update 1. So I decided not to apologize and instead I just told my grandparents what my brother had texted me. It's been 3 days since those texts and I think that was the best way to go. When I showed my grandparents those texts, they got really mad and told me that if I ever receive any texts like these again, then I'm supposed to just block the number immediately, without giving them a chance to speak to me anymore. They were furious, even more so when I'd first come over. My grandmother was very upset, almost on the verge of tears, and my grandpa was very angry. I feel like they know more than they're letting on because the way they reacted made me feel as if it was kind of an overreaction. I haven't asked them anything because right now I'm already dealing with a lot on my plate. I just don't understand why my parents and my brother felt the need to text me and make me feel like crap over something I did just because it was the last straw for me. I'm not exaggerating, but the basement is a pretty dark and disgusting place, and it also always has a very weird smell hanging about the room. But my parents insisted that I move there just so that my brother could live comfortably. If they really wanted to help my brother out, then they could have helped him out with the rent. They can afford it. And if they're letting him and the kids move in, then they might as well have sent him money. It doesn't make sense that he's too proud to make a habit of taking money from his parents, but he's not too proud to come live with his parents along with his wife and kids when he's an adult and force his younger brother to move to the dank basement. I don't see why I have to make sacrifices for it and act like I'm sorry for anything. They never showed me any love. The least they could do for me was spend money on me. I don't have to thank them for doing the least for me. Update 2. Hey everybody, I'm going to share something here that I found out a couple of days back. It's been 1 week since my last update, and I'd already been suspecting that there was a lot more to this than my grandparents and even my parents were letting me in on, and I turned out to be right, which is unfortunate because what I found out, not very pleasant. I've not been able to process it for a while, but I guess typing it out will help me. I can't talk to anyone about this because it's just horrible. It sucks big time, and I can't bring myself to accept it, even though deep down I always knew there must have been something like this that my family had been hiding from me. So, a couple of days back, before I found out, I decided to ask my grandparents really casually about why exactly they'd reacted the way they did the other day when I told them about the texts that my brother had sent me. At first, they refused to answer and told me that they were just a little overwhelmed because of the situation, and since they were upset about how my mother was acting, but I knew they weren't telling me the whole truth. So I pushed. And then they finally said that it was because they blamed themselves for how my parents had been treating me. I didn't understand, so then my grandpa explained that the real reason my parents excluded me from the family and acted like they didn't want me around was because they really hadn't wanted me. They'd only planned on having one child, my brother, and after that my mother had thought about getting a hysterectomy, but she didn't because my grandparents told her not to. She got pregnant again 10 years later, when she was 35, and she wanted to terminate the pregnancy as soon as she found out, for a couple of reasons. One, because she didn't want a kid, and neither did my dad, and two, because she was already in her mid-30s, and she didn't want to push herself into a complicated pregnancy situation. It was likely that getting pregnant at that age could go south in no time, but yet again, my grandparents convinced her to have me. There was a lot of fighting, because my parents really didn't want me, but somehow my grandparents managed to persuade them to continue the pregnancy because apparently they'd promised my parents that if they gave birth of me, then they'd take care of all my expenses. But they just wanted me to be born. So against all odds, I was born, and then, even though my parents had me, they weren't enthusiastic about me at all and treated me as more of a burden than a joy to have. This explained a couple of things, like the age gap between my brother and me, and also why my parents had never hesitated to pay for anything I wanted. I found it disgusting that they tried to fool me into believing that I needed to feel sorry for them because I'd complained to my grandparents about how they'd been treating me as they'd spent money on me, and now I found out that they hadn't even done that. All they'd done was let me have a place in their home, but they even took that away from me to give to their grandkids. They'd neglected me, made me feel like crap about myself, and now they had no qualms about lying to me just so they get their inheritance back. They disgusted me, and I was actually glad that I'd left that house and them behind, because truly, they didn't deserve to be parents. I'd always tried my best to win them over, but now I knew nothing would ever be enough, because they'd made up their minds to hate me before I was even born. As for what my grandparents did, I don't know how to feel. On one hand, I'm very grateful that they're the reason I was even born and had the lifestyle that I was used to. They even took me in now that I had nobody else to turn to. But it feels bad because had they at least bothered to dig deeper, then maybe I wouldn't have had to feel the way I did for the last 17 years of my life. My grandparents knew that my parents didn't want me, and yet they'd talked them into having me. But after I was born, they let the same people raise me without ever trying to go beyond the surface to make sure that they were treating me well. I knew they were doing this for the inheritance, because my grandparents wanted 2 grandkids, and if my parents wanted to inherit their house and all their other assets, they had to respect these people. But after they lost the inheritance, they didn't need to show them the same love and respect anymore, so that's why my parents were acting the way they were. Also, they're successful doctors and earn enough now, so it's not how it was 17 years ago. My parents were comfortable, but they weren't rich back then, so the idea of the inheritance was very appealing to them, but now they have enough money of their own. My grandpa has his own company, so he's still more successful and has more money, but my parents aren't too far behind. They'd been hoping to inherit the business and make money off of that after my grandparents passed away, but that wasn't happening anymore. So they were mad, but they weren't sad about it. Not enough to apologize for anything, at least. I have mixed feelings about everything right now. I don't know what to say anymore, honestly. Update 3. Hi, so my parents have decided that they're going to give up my parental rights so my grandparents can legally adopt me. They've discussed it all among themselves already, and 2 days back my grandparents just asked me if I'd be okay with that. I knew they were just asking to make me feel better, but the truth was that the decision had already been made for me. I had no other option other than to say yes. I might sound ungrateful right now, but this kind of thing has been messing with my head ever since I found out just how unwanted I was. I said yes because it's not like I can just stroll back into my parents' house and pretend like it's my own again, so this is how it's going to be now. My grandparents have been trying their best to make me feel better about this whole thing, and I really appreciate it. They screwed up with my parents, but I'm glad that they're trying to fix it by taking me in and, going above and beyond for me even at their age. They're in their 70s, so it's kind of a big deal for them that they're adopting me. It's going to be a long ride, but I still have 1 whole year before I get to 18, so we need to deal with this legally to make sure that my parents don't try to stir up any trouble by using me as a pawn. I'm stressed out, majorly upset, and really sad about everything. But I can only hope that the future is better than whatever's going on right now.